What would you do if you were the hired pianist in the corner of a room full of people who had never once looked at you, and the most dangerous man on the coast walked past your bench, and you did not even glance up because you were working and you did not know who he was, and behind you, in a silence that spread through 200 guests, he smiled for the first time in years and said, "That one. Bring her to me." Nobody ignored Rémy Duchamp. That was the entire architecture of his world, a room that turned when he entered it, faces arranging themselves into welcome before he had crossed a threshold, 100 people performing delight for a man they were terrified of. He had not been genuinely overlooked by another human being in 15 years. And then a soft, generously built woman at a piano in the corner, who had been hired for the evening the way the flowers had been hired for the evening, played straight through his arrival without lifting her head, and something happened in the coldest man on that coast that his own lieutenants had never seen. This is a story of hidden worth, of a woman the world had trained to be furniture, and of the ruthless man who was undone by the first person in 15 years who did not notice him at all. Sylvie Arbor had spent her whole life being hired and never met. She was 31, soft and generously curved, with a calm, absorbed face and quick, careful hands, and she had learned young that a woman built like her who wanted to be near music would be permitted to make it only from the corners of rooms, never the center. She had been a serious pianist once, a gifted one, until a conservatory audition where a panel listened to her play and then talked in front of her about her presence, about whether an audience would accept a performer who looked like that, and passed her over, and she had understood at 19 exactly what the ceiling was made of. So she had built a life on the other side of it, playing at functions and hotel bars and private parties, background music for people who did not know she was there, and she had made a kind of peace with it, because at least she was still playing. What none of the people who hired her ever discovered was what Sylvie actually was. Underneath the black dress and the polite invisibility, because Sylvie Arbor had an ear like almost no one alive. It was perfect pitch, and then something considerably past it, a hearing so absolute she had never in her life forgotten a voice, not a face. Faces slipped away from her like everyone else's. But a voice once heard was filed forever, its exact timbre and cadence, and the architecture of how a person shaped a vowel. She had spent 15 years playing in corners where powerful people talked freely, 3 feet from the piano, and had accumulated, without intending to, a vast private library of voices, and never mentioned it to a soul, because a hired pianist who says, "I have heard you before, sir," is one who is not hired again. And on the night everything changed, she was playing at a private function and did not look up when the room went quiet, because she was working and because she had trained herself for 15 years never to look up. Rémy Duchamp was the reason rooms had temperatures. He was tall and broad and dressed in a charcoal suit cut with lethal precision, the head of a syndicate that owned the ports and the freight lines and the fear of every powerful family for 100 miles, and he was rumored to end a life with a single unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice. He never needed to. And he had come to that function tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, because he had spent 15 years in rooms full of people who were performing at him, and he had begun to suspect that he had not had a real conversation since his father died. He crossed the room, and it turned toward him the way it always did, faces assembling into welcome, conversations bending in his direction. And in the corner, a woman at a piano played straight through it. She did not falter. She did not look up. She was somewhere else, entirely inside the music, her whole attention on her own hands, and Rémy Duchamp stopped walking and stood there and watched a person be completely, genuinely unaware of him for the first time in 15 years. It was, he would think later, the most restful 30 seconds of his adult life. And then he smiled, which his lieutenants had not seen him do in years, and said, quietly, "That one, bring her to me." And here the evening did not go the way anyone expected, because a man went to the piano and touched the pianist's shoulder and told her Monsieur Duchamp wished to speak with her, and Sylvie Aubert finished her phrase, looked up with polite incomprehension, said she was contracted until 11, and went back to playing. The man came back to Remy with an expression of pure terror and repeated it. And 200 people watched the most feared man on the coast throw his head back and laugh out loud, a real one, in front of everybody, for the first time in living memory. He did not send anyone a second time. And at 4 minutes past, when she rose from the bench and gathered her music, he was standing at a respectful distance with his hands where she could see them, and he said, "I am told I frightened your evening, and I would like to apologize for having you summoned like a bottle of wine." That was thoughtlessly done. And Sylvie, who had spent 15 years being handled by staff and never once addressed by a host, looked properly at him for the first time. "Nobody told me who you were," she said. "I know," said Remy Duchamp. "That is precisely why I would like to buy you a coffee." They talked until 4 in the morning. Remy Duchamp, who had not had an honest conversation in 15 years, sat in an all-night place across from a woman who wanted nothing from him, who did not know enough about his world to be frightened by it in the right places, and who talked about music the way he had once talked about the family before it swallowed him. He asked what she had been playing when he walked in. She told him. He asked why she played in corners, and she was quiet a moment, and then told him about a panel at 19 who had discussed her body in front of her and decided an audience would not accept it, and Remy Duchamp went very still in a way that would have frightened anyone who knew him. And then she said the thing that changed everything, without knowing she had said anything at all. She said offhandedly that the man who had come to fetch her had a strange voice, and that she had heard it before, months ago, at a completely different function on the other side of the harbour, standing beside a man she was fairly sure was not a friend of the family whose party she had been playing at. Remy set down his cup. "What do you mean? You heard it," he said. And Sylvie Aubert told a stranger the thing she had never told anyone, that she remembered every voice she had ever heard, that she could not help it, that 15 years of playing in the corners of rooms had given her a library of them, and that the man's voice had been filed away since a night in March. And Remy Duchamp looked at her, the way no one had ever looked at her in her life. He did not use her. That was the thing that undid her over the weeks that followed. He offered her work plainly and told her the truth about what he was and what he wanted, which was a pair of ears in rooms where he could not be sure who was lying, and he told her she could refuse and he would still see her safely home and never trouble her again. She did not refuse. She told herself it was the money which was extraordinary. It was not only the money. And so began the slow unfolding of a woman who had spent 15 years playing in corners because Remy Duchamp did the one thing no one had ever done, which was to put her at the center of the room. He did not hide her. He sat her at the piano at meetings and dinners and sit-downs, where she had always been, and afterward asked what she had heard, and she told him, and time after time she was right. She identified a man, introduced as a supplier, as someone she had heard 2 years earlier in a rival's house. She caught a lie in a lieutenant's voice, from the way it thinned on a single word. And Remy, who trusted no one, began to trust the pianist, and slowly the walls came down. He learned that she hummed under her breath when she was thinking, and stopped the instant she noticed. He learned she flinched at raised voices and softened at kindness, and it made him want to find every member of that conservatory panel and explain to them, at length, exactly what they had thrown away. Every evening, they sat over a decanter of amber whiskey he poured for himself and a glass of wine he poured for her, and he told her about the father he had buried and the trust he had learned to bury with him, things he had said to no one. And one night, after she had played for an hour, for no one but him, his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and he said quietly, "Tell me to stop," and Sylvie, who had spent her whole life in the corner of rooms, said, "Do not," and he murmured goodnight into her hair like a man saying something sacred, "Chérie," and left her with her heart going like a bird. But Sylvie, being Sylvie, had never stopped thinking about the voice from March, and the more she listened in that house, the more certain she became that she had heard it somewhere else too, somewhere much closer. The cruelty came at a formal gathering, and it arrived, wearing diamonds and certainty. Remy had brought Sylvie in a gown of deep midnight blue that celebrated every curve she had spent 31 years being told to hide, seated at his right hand instead of at the instrument, and midway through the evening, a sleek, beautiful woman named Océane, who had spent 2 years positioning herself to be the next Madame Duchamp, cornered her by the tall windows with an audience in tow. "Oh, the piano girl," Océane said brightly, loud enough for the room, letting her eyes travel over Sylvie's body with theatrical sympathy. He laughed. Apparently, she smiled like a blade. "Do try to understand what you are, sweetheart. He is a man who has grown bored, and boredom makes powerful men do novel things, and you are very novel. But novelty wears off, and then he will want a woman who can stand beside him in this world, and nobody, and I do mean nobody, looks at the fat girl they hired to play the piano and sees a queen. Go back to the corner before it becomes humiliating." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees, and the old Sylvie would have absorbed it, gone quietly back to the bench, played something soothing until the shaking stopped. But something had been rebuilt in her, and she did not lower her eyes. "You are right that they hired me for the corner," Sylvie said, her quiet voice carrying with perfect clarity. 15 years of it in rooms exactly like this one, 3 feet from people who spoke freely, because they had decided I was furniture. She tilted her head. "Which is how I know, Océane, that the man you arrived with tonight was at a house across the water in March, and that I have heard his voice twice more since, and that on every one of those occasions he was standing beside someone from this family. So do be careful whose corner you are sending me back to." She heard everything you all said in it. The silence had teeth. Océane went white. And Remy, who had crossed the floor in silence, took Sylvie's hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in front of the entire gathering. "You never make yourself small in this house again, chérie," he murmured. "Not in my world, and never in front of me." But past Océane's shoulder, a man who had served the Duchamp family for 21 years had gone very still, because the pianist had just described, in front of 40 people, the outline of the thing he had spent 2 years building, and because he alone in that room understood that a woman who never forgets a voice was the single most dangerous person alive to him. The man was Laurent Rémy Duchamp's consigliere, and he had made one fatal assumption, which was that nobody listens to the music. For 2 years, Laurent had been arranging to hand the family to a rival, and he had done it with a caution that bordered on genius, never writing anything down, never making a call that could be traced, conducting every piece of business in person, out loud, in the safest place he knew, which was a room with people in it. He had learned long ago that the most private place in the world is a crowded party, that 2 men talking quietly beside a piano are less observed than 2 men meeting alone anywhere on earth. He had brokered his entire betrayal in the ambient noise of gatherings like this one over 2 years, in a dozen houses, and not a word of it had ever been written or recorded or overheard by anyone who mattered. Except the pianist had been in the corner of 9 of those rooms, and the pianist did not forget voices. Laurent smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Sylvie brought it to Remy that night, and she brought it the way she brought everything, completely, and with the certainty of a woman who did not guess about voices but knew them. She had gone back through 15 years of playing in her mind, function by function, room by room, and she had pulled out every occasion on which she had heard the voice from March and the voices it had been speaking with. There were nine gatherings across 2 years, in 6 houses, and at every one of them the same 2 voices had spoken quietly together somewhere within her hearing, one belonging to a man from a rival house, and the other, she said, and then had to stop and start again, the other belonging to the man who had stood at Remy's shoulder for 21 years. She had heard Laurent's voice 1,000 times. She could no more mistake it than a person could mistake their own name. She laid it out on the table without drama, in order, 9 nights, 6 houses, 2 years. And Remy Duchamp went very still, and then he did the thing that undid her completely. He believed her, instantly. He did not ask her twice. He did not demand corroboration from a man with a title, or evidence he could hold in his hand, because he understood, looking at her, that he was being handed the only evidence that existed. He looked at a case built entirely out of remembered sound, assembled by a woman 15 years of powerful people, had dismissed as background noise, and said, quietly, "Laurent?"
"Yes,"
said Sylvie. Then he took her face in his hands and said, "If I move on him, and he sees it coming, he will not come at me, he will come at you, because you are not a witness he can discredit or a document he can burn. You are the only copy." And neither of them knew that Laurent had already made that decision. The fortress went dark at 2:30. Sylvie woke to a silence so complete it pressed against her skin, and every instinct 15 years of listening had honed, screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. The power was out. The generators stayed dead. Remy had been drawn out at midnight to a meeting she now understood was a fabrication. And Sylvie, sitting up in the dark, knew with terrible certainty that day had come while he was away, and that day had come for her because she was the only copy. She did not scream. She did not faint. She did not run blindly. She thought cold and clear, the way she always had in the middle of a difficult passage when everything was happening at once, and panic would have ruined it. 2 floors below, a silenced weapon coughed, and a body met the marble. And Sylvie Aubert did the thing that no one in that house, friend or enemy, had ever thought to account for, because the men moving through the dark had night optics and a floor plan, and every advantage except the one that mattered, which was that they had come to hunt in the pitch black. She could hear them, not vaguely, not as a frightened person, hears noises in a dark house. She heard them the way she heard a chord, 4 sets of footfalls in 4 rooms, and she could tell you the size of each room by the way the sound came back, could hear the difference between a floorboard under carpet and one under stone, could place a man by the acoustics of his own breathing. She moved through the black with absolute confidence, going first to the study where a hard-wired line ran on its own circuit and got one message out. And then she used the only instrument she had ever needed. The house had an intercom, an old wired one, with speakers in every wing. Sylvie went to the panel by feel, and she began to play the house. She sent her own footsteps into the east wing, while she stood in the west. She sent a door, closing into the cellar. She sent, through 6 speakers in 6 rooms, the small sounds of a frightened woman moving just ahead, always just ahead, and 4 armed men with excellent optics, and no idea that sound could lie chased a woman who was never once where they heard her. She scattered them across 3 floors in under 9 minutes. And then she heard the one set of footsteps that had not moved at all, standing perfectly still in the corridor outside, and she knew whose they were before he spoke, because she had known that walk for months. "Sylvie," said Laurent pleasantly, into the dark. "Clever girl, you are using the intercom." He did not move. "Do you know, I have spent 2 years conducting the most delicate work of my life out loud in rooms full of people, because I understood something none of my rivals ever have, which is that the safest place to say a dangerous thing is a party. Nobody listens at a party, nobody except, apparently, the woman at the piano. But you have made one mistake tonight. You have scattered my men. You have not moved me. And I am standing between you and every door in this wing, and you cannot play a corridor." And Sylvie Arbert, standing in the dark with her heart steady and her whole world made of sound, did the one thing he never expected, because she had never been the helpless thing he took her for. "You have made the mistake, Laurent," she said. Silence. "You think you have me in the dark," she said, "but I have spent 15 years in the corners of rooms exactly like this house, and here is what that builds. I do not need light. I have known where you were standing since before you spoke, because you shift your weight to your left every 4 seconds, and have done it as long as I have known you. And there is a marble threshold, 9 feet behind you, that changes your voice by a fraction every time you cross it." She let it settle. "And I am not the only copy anymore. 6 days ago I sat down and wrote all of it out. 9 gatherings, 6 houses, every date, every voice, and it is sitting with 3 people who will hand it to Remy, and the whole commission, the moment I stop confirming I am alive. You spent 2 years hiding your treason in plain sound because you were certain nobody was listening. You picked the one room on this coast with a musician in the corner." Laurent said nothing, which was the closest thing to a concession she would ever get. And in that silence, the front gates below exploded inward, with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits. Remy had come home. Time seemed to fracture. Gunfire erupted below, brief and brutal and absolute, and Laurent turned toward it, and in that instant Sylvie moved, because she had known for the last 2 minutes exactly where the service door was, and exactly how many steps lay between her and it, having counted them in the dark, on her first week out of pure habit. And she was through it, and had the bolt thrown, before he understood she had left the corridor. And then the far end flooded with light, and Remy filled it, soaked in rain, his eyes wild and searching. Yves, his loyal lieutenant, poured in behind him with a crowd of armed men, and the trap Laurent had spent 2 years building snapped shut around him instead. Remy had him by the throat against the wall before he could speak. 21 years, he said. You sold me in rooms I was standing in, and when a woman heard you, you came into my house for her. Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear, and he released Laurent to Yves' men and crossed to the service door as Sylvie opened it and came out into his arms. His hands moved frantically over her arms, her face, her hands, checking for any harm to what was his. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me." "I'm all right," Sylvie said, steady even now, though her fingers curled into his soaked coat. "I put my footsteps in the east wing and stood in the west. 15 years of nobody listening to me turns out to be excellent training." And Remy Duchamp let out a broken, disbelieving laugh into her hair, and then he framed her face in his shaking hands and looked at her the way no one in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her. "You are magnificent," he breathed. He conducted 2 years of treason out loud in 9 rooms, and every man I employ heard nothing, and you had all of it, filed, since March. And then his voice cracked open entirely. "Do you know what I understood? The night you did not look up, he said hoarsely. That I had spent 15 years in rooms where everyone performed for me and no one saw me, and that the first person who ever looked at me properly was the only one in the building who had not been looking at me at all. He pressed his forehead to hers. They put you in the corner, chérie, and you heard everything, and you saved my life with it. Laurent, the man who had smiled at Remy Duchamp for 21 years while selling him out loud in crowded rooms, learned the price of underestimating her before the week was out. Remy did not act in blind rage. He let Sylvie lay the whole of it before the commission. 9 gatherings, 6 houses, 2 years, every date and every voice, all of it held in the memory of a woman that world had hired and never once met. And when the 5 families had heard it and the rival house that had been meeting Laurent beside a dozen pianos was exposed along with him, Sylvie did not counsel death. You do not need to make him a martyr, she said quietly. You need to make him nothing. So they did it her way. They stripped Laurent of every asset and exposed 2 years of treason to the families he had schemed to serve, and cast him out, alive, bankrupt, disgraced, his name a warning whispered at every table on the coast, a fate the old men agreed was far crueler than any quick and merciful bullet. And Océane, who had said that nobody looks at the fat girl they hired to play the piano and sees a queen, discovered that the man she had arrived with was the rival's broker whose voice Sylvie had filed away in March, and spent a long and humiliating season explaining an association she could not explain. And afterward, watched from the far end of every table, Sylvie now sat at the head of. As for the conservatory that had passed over a 19-year-old because of the shape of her body, it received, some years later, an endowment of startling size on one condition, that the panel be blind. Every applicant heard from behind a screen. It is still done that way. Nobody there knows why. Months later, when a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Sylvie Auber sat at a concert, grand in the great room of a house where she was no longer background music, playing for an audience of 1, and she did not make herself small for anyone anymore. She wore rich colors tailored to celebrate every curve she had spent 31 years being told to hide, and she took up exactly as much room as she pleased, and she played at the center of the room. Remy came in and stopped, simply to listen, the way he had stopped 15 feet from her bench on the night that changed both their lives. You're staring, Monsieur Duchamp, she said, without missing a note. I will never stop, he said, crossing to her. Do you know what I understood? That first night, he said quietly. Every person in that room turned when I walked in, and one woman did not, and I have never in my life been so grateful to be ignored. He lifted her hand from the keys and pressed his lips to her knuckles. They put you in the corner because they decided the shape of you mattered more than the sound of you, chérie. And you sat in that corner for 15 years and heard everything this coast has ever whispered, and when a man came to take my family apart, you were the only person alive who could name him. You were never background. You were the only one in any of those rooms who was truly present. Sylvie looked up at the man the whole city feared, a man who bowed to no one and yet bowed entirely. To her, and for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent 31 years being hired and never met, judged at 19 by people who talked about her body while her music was still in the air, taught that a woman like her would only be permitted to play from the edges, and she had proven every last cruelty wrong. Because the ear the world had never thought to ask about had saved an empire and a life. A room full of powerful people had turned to look at the most dangerous man on the coast. One woman had not looked up, and by the time his enemy understood what she was, the girl they had all hired to fill the silence had been listening to every single word of it for 15 years. If Sylvie and Remy's story of hidden worth, quiet defiance, and hard-won recognition moved you, If your heart caught when the pianist did not look up, and the most feared man on the coast laughed out loud for the first time in years, then do us a small favor. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that the people who treat you as background have no idea what you have heard. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us what was your favorite moment in Sylvie and Remy's story.